Good evening. My name is Joe Horn. I'm Community Development Director for the county, and I'd like to welcome you to the public forum for the educational impact fee. This is the second of 3 meetings. We met last night down at Independence High School, and next Wednesday night, which I believe is the 21st, we'll be meeting at Nolensville High School. So any and all are welcome to attend. Just a couple of things. We are going live tonight out on WCTV. And so with that, if there's any questions we might have, we have a microphone. We'd like to get those questions on tape or on, on the air, so for the benefit of anybody who watches it now, or benefit of anybody who might watch it on a playback. Very briefly, educational impact fee process began roughly a year ago. There was a resolution passed by the Williamson County Commission to explore whether or not educational impact fee would be a way to look toward funding capital cost for the Williamson County school system in the future. Upon the passage of that, we solicited requests for proposal from different firms, and we received 3, and one of them was from a firm out of Bethesda, American, named Tischler Bice, and we awarded that contract to Tischler Bice. And Carson Bice is the principal in charge of this particular project. So rather than prattle on, I'm going to let Carson start the presentation. And like I said, I would love to. I know how quick it is. It's such a somewhat of an intimate venue we have right now. But if there's any questions, I'd love to at least again try to get you on tape so the listening audience can have a chance. Okay, Carson.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, those watching at home as well as those here in the audience. I'm Carson Bice with Tischler Bice. As Joe mentioned, we're a consulting firm based in Bethesda, Maryland. We also have an office in Bradenton, Florida. Our firm is unique in that we specialize specifically on cost of growth issues. We're known for fiscal impact analysis, economic impact analysis, impact fees, and we've done more impact fee studies than any firm in the country, as well as more school impact fees than any firm either. We've also do a lot of market feasibility analysis and develop fiscal and economic software. What I'm going to do tonight is take the audience through some basic impact fee ground rules, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the actual study with the cost assumptions and level of service assumptions that go into the study. First, let's talk about how do you fund infrastructure. And funding mechanisms vary from state to state, but regardless of state, there's very few options. Essentially, you have general taxes, and that's really what varies from state to state, and that relates to what sort of growth-related revenue sources the jurisdiction has at their disposal, whether it's property tax, sales tax. Some states have income taxes, franchise fees, those types of things, special purpose taxes, which are generally, voter-approved taxes, privilege taxes like you have here in Williamson County. But once you get past those general revenue sources, the toolbox starts to thin out a little bit. And essentially you have impact fees as an option, or you have the option of accepting lower levels of service if you choose to do nothing, or you can shift the burden onto more of a localized area through the use of special assessment districts, community facility districts, those types of financing mechanisms. They vary by name, they vary from state to state, but essentially it's an assessment in order to pay for those needed infrastructure or the needed facilities that you're trying to fund. Well, let's talk a little bit about impact fees. As we define an impact fee, it's essentially new growth's fair share of growth-related capital infrastructure, whether it's water and sewer, parks, libraries, roads, schools. It's the same type of approach for each type of facility. You're trying to figure out what's the commensurate or pro rata share of each land use's impact. There are some ground rules with impact fees. They're governed in most states by some sort of enabling legislation. In the state of Tennessee, they're governed by private acts, which Williamson County has one for educational impact fees. And those private acts set out different ground rules such as accounting requirements. For instance, impact fees cannot be deposited into the county's general fund. They need to be accounted for separately in interest-bearing accounts, in an annual report published each year that tracks the revenues and expenditures. We also have to show basically or meet three prongs of a legal test. The first are what we refer to as need, or the nexus, and that's essentially telling the story of growth has occurred in Williamson County, it's going to continue in the future, and that growth is going to necessitate the need for additional education facilities. We have to also show benefit, and benefit is shown in two ways. First is a geographic benefit, which leads us to analyze where growth is occurring in the county, where there may or may not be excess capacity, whether we need to adopt service areas for the impact fees. But given what we found in Williamson County, it is a county-wide service area with one exception, and that's the Franklin Special School District, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation. We also show benefit through the timing of the expenditure. We just can't collect the money and sit on it for 10, 15, or 20 years. We need to spend that money in an adequate period of time to provide that benefit to the fee payer. And finally, we have to meet what we call proportionality. And that's making sure that each land use isn't paying more than its fair share or the share demanded. That's why we differentiate fees for school impact fees by type of unit. We just don't have a residential fee. You separate it out into single family versus multifamily because each housing unit has different characteristics in terms of household size and the number of public school children that they benefit, or excuse me, that they generate. There are also three general methods for calculating impact fees. The way to think about those are looking to the future, looking at the current situation, or looking to the past. When we look to the past, what we call that is a cost recovery or buy-in. The idea here is that the county has oversized facilities from which new growth will benefit, and so new growth would pay for that or buy into that excess capacity. The present look is what we call a consumption-based method, and that's what we're using today for the Williamson County Education Impact Fee. That's essentially taking a snapshot of where the county's school system is in terms of levels of service for bricks and mortar, for land and other facilities, and then determining what that cost is in the future to replicate that level of service. And when you look to the future, that's what we call a plan-based approach, where you take some sort of adopted master plan and base the fee on the assumption that you're going to build facilities X, Y, and Z. There's some downsides to that approach. One is that it sort of hems you in. It doesn't allow you to respond to the market because you've already obligated yourself to build certain facilities, and you may need to switch midstream depending on where growth goes. So that consumption-based approach allows more flexibility in terms of expending the money. When we talk about eligible cost for an impact fee, obviously facilities and improvements that are required to serve new development are eligible. We cannot use the money to make maintenance or repairs to existing school facilities. Okay, we can't use impact fees for HVAC replacements, roof replacements, etc. We also cannot use the impact fees for operating costs. In rare occasions where a community is not growing very fast, which is not the case in Williamson County, you can recoup excess capacity within your existing facilities through that cost recovery method I mentioned earlier. In terms of the conceptual calculation of impact fees, and this graphic here is for parks because it's sort of a little easier to explain, but it's pretty simple math on the surface. You're determining what are the demand units generated by each type of development. So in this case, we're talking about residential housing. So in the case of parks, it's persons per household. In the case of schools, it's public school students per unit, okay? And then we determine what are the infrastructure units demanded, okay? So for schools, that's going to be bricks and mortar, that's going to be land, it's going to be buses, administrative and support facilities. And then we look at, well, what does it cost to replicate that? So what does it cost us to buy an acre of land? What does it cost us to build a square foot of K through 8 versus high school bricks and mortar? And so we do that math to come up with the impact fee. We also have to incorporate within the methodology the idea of credits, okay? So with impact fees, we have to guard against new development paying twice, once through the impact fee and then again through another revenue source, okay? We also have to guard against or include within the resolution components for granting site-specific credits. So site-specific credits, an example of that would be a developer comes to the county and dedicates land for a school site, okay? So we have to account for that in the impact fees. So a development agreement would be entered into where one of two things would happen. One, the developer upfronts the land and is then paid back through a future stream of impact fee revenue. Or you structure the development agreement where a reduced impact fee is paid that does not include the land component, okay? So we do have to make that developer whole if they're providing some part of what we're collecting or charging the impact fee for. The other type of credits that I mentioned earlier, typically or primarily for dedicated revenues. So if we have property tax or local option sales tax, or in Williamson County's case, a privilege tax. We have two privilege taxes. We have the adequate school privilege tax, and then we have the adequate public facilities privilege tax. And so we have to account for the fact that a portion of that money does go to pay for capacity. So we got to make sure that we don't double count within the impact fee methodology. So we're often asked, why should a community consider impact fees? Well, if you're like most communities we work with around the country, you're seeing, increased competition for tax dollars. You're dealing with unfunded mandates, and so there's still a need to maintain high quality levels of service, and so impact fees could go a long way to accommodating that. If you want to continue to be an attractive place to live, you want to continue to attract economic development, you need to maintain that high quality infrastructure. A lot of people or a lot of communities are also competing for workforce. The old model of people follow the jobs is gone. Now the jobs follow people. People want to live in areas that are attractive, and so impact fees can certainly help with that attraction. Impact fees can also minimize what we call externalities like school overcrowding. A lot of communities we work with, there's a high no growth sentiment. So if the general public feels that or understands that new growth is offsetting the infrastructure needs generated by new development, they can be somewhat placated. And finally, because of the accounting requirements and legal requirements of impact fees, it sort of blends comprehensive planning, economic development, and revenue strategies into one sort of system. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more communities think about is balancing your funding needs against economic competitiveness. So you want to make sure that you're still competitive in the marketplace, but at the same time provide the infrastructure level of service that got you that competitive advantage in the first place. So in terms of our process, it's basically a 7-step scope of work. First part is determining or painting the picture or telling the story of the nexus or the need for school impact fees, and that's looking at how the county has grown in the past, documenting where you are today, and then projecting future growth in terms of housing units and public school enrollment. We also, then we go to defining existing levels of service and school capital needs and the cost assumptions that we're going to use within the analysis. We determine the appropriate public school student generation rates. So that, in essence, is the number of school children on average generated by single-family versus multifamily housing units. We evaluate the need for offsetting credits or revenue credits. We calculate the fees, and then we meet with stakeholders, which is the part of the process we're in now. And then once that stakeholder outreach is done, the adoption process will begin. Now, in terms of the Williamson County School Impact Fee overview, there are 2 points I think that we need to make. First is the fee categories are comprised of two components. One is K through 8, which includes elementary and middle school. And then there's a high school component, which is grades 9 through 12. As I mentioned earlier, there's essentially 2 service areas. Development within the Franklin Special School District will only pay the high school impact fee because Franklin Special School District provides its own K through 8 facilities, okay? Development outside of the Franklin Special School District, everywhere else in the county, will pay both the 9 through 12 impact fee as well as the high school impact fee. It's also important to note that all the revenue generated goes to Williamson County. None of the revenue is going to the Franklin Special School District at all. Let's turn our attention to student generation rates. I know this table or this slide is somewhat busy, but the way we determine pupil generation rates is we look at the public use micro-sample data that's published by the U.S. Census Bureau, okay? And it usually lags 2 or 3 years behind, and so that's why you see the red note here that says we're using 2013 enrollment, because the latest, or the most recent PUMS at the time we initiated the study was 2013. And so we want to make sure we're looking at apples to apples when we crunch the data. And so we basically use those raw pupil generation rates that we develop from the PUMS data to generate an enrollment total. And then we compare that to the actual enrollment that existed in 2013 within the Williamson County School District. And so what happens is there's a series of iterations that occur. Is the raw pupil generation rates will usually generate more school students than they're actually in the system, because we have to account for the fact that some school children, or school-age children, are either homeschooled or attend private schools. And so once we know what that percentage is, we then calibrate the numbers down to match the Williamson County enrollment and get the pupil generation rates that are shown in the boxed area. If you look at the bottom, a single-family housing unit is projected to generate 0.554 public school children. A multifamily unit is projected to generate 0.299 public school children. This next slide shows the enrollment projections that have been developed by the Williamson County schools. They have a very robust methodology that ages students through the system, but also has a new growth component. And our experience has been that they've been very, very accurate with their projections for each school year. As this table indicates, over the next 5 years, a projected increase in enrollment of slightly over 11,000 students is projected to occur. And that's a growth rate of overall of 6.1%, which is very, very high. Now let's turn our attention to the level of service and cost projections that we're using in the analysis. I'm sure that this table is somewhat hard to read for those in the audience as well as those at home. But what this essentially replicates is all the K through 8 schools. We show what the site acreage is for each school. We show what the building square footage is for each school, what the permanent capacity of each building is, as well as the current enrollment. And then we get utilization. So as you can see at the bottom of the table, the utilization rate is 84%, meaning that present conditions, there's 16% capacity remaining in K through 8. Now obviously that's a moving target or a moving number because it depends on when schools open. So you may find yourself next year that capacity is at 98%, but then you build a new school and it's back down to 88%. And so it's a constantly moving number, which is why we use, since you're under capacity, we use permanent capacity as the denominator or the definer for determining what the level of service standard is, okay? Because you've built the infrastructure system to accommodate that permanent capacity, okay? If we used actual enrollment, we would be overstating the actual level of service. And you can see at the bottom of the table the level of service standards for land and land and building are, let's see here. This is so small I can't even read it. Oh, it's 116 square feet per student and 0.028 acres per student at the K through 8 level. We do the same thing for the high school level, acreages, building square footage, capacity and enrollment, and similar to the K through 8, the high schools are at 85% versus 84% for K through 8, so there is some existing capacity. So again, we use that permanent capacity to determine the level of service of 0.034 acres per student, as well as 149 square feet per student for bricks and mortar. So now we've defined these levels of service in terms of square footage per student and acreage per student. We now have to define, well, what does it cost to build this infrastructure today if we're to replicate this level of service. And so what we've done is we've looked at, we've taken a weighted average approach where we look at historical purchases of land going back usually 5 or 6 years, so we get a weighted average because we understand that in all communities, the value of land per acre varies by geographic location, and so we want to get a representative sample. And as you can see here at the bottom right-hand corner, highlighted in green, the average or weighted average cost per acre is $55,346. So that's the cost figure that we're assuming for land in the impact fee study. This slide here shows the same type of approach for construction cost. We have differentiated between high school and K through 8 because much like every other community we worked with schools, it does cost more to build a high school than it does a K through 8 type of facility. So again, we've taken a weighted average looking at some recent construction. It's about $156 for per square foot for K through 8 and about $166 per square foot for high schools. The next component is the operations and support, or the admin type facilities. This is comprised of the operations support building, the textbook building, the transportation facility, as well as the equipment shed. And so we compare that total square footage to existing enrollment in order to determine a square foot per student level of service. And then we've determined that the replacement cost for the type of facilities that Williamson County has today to build that tomorrow would be $165 per square foot. And so that's how we get the cost per student of $257.10. The final component, or cost component, is for buses, and that's comprised of both the regular buses as well as the special education. It's estimated that to replace these tomorrow, and, as if you were buying new units, a regular bus would cost $78,500. A special education bus, almost $90,000. And so we look at that total asset value, compare it to the existing enrollment to determine a cost per student of $580.06. Okay, the next component we have is the credit. And so we have a very interesting situation here where first, the county is responsible for 100% of the capital cost for new schools, okay? And historically, the county has debt financed a large number of the growth-related facilities and have used privilege tax to fund much of that debt service. And I mentioned that the privilege taxes are a one-time revenue, okay? So what we've done is we've tried to because it's complicated in that, for every dollar of privilege tax, some of it goes to pay debt service, some of it's going to non-growth related school expenditures, and some of them are used for cash expenditures. And so we thought the most conservative approach would be to look at, let's look at principal and interest on bonded debt, since a large percentage of that, or a large percentage of the privilege tax is used to retire that debt. And so we look at the remaining amortization schedule, compare it to projected enrollment, and to get a net present value of slightly over $5,000 per student at the K through 8 level. And then we do the same thing on remaining debt for high school to get a net present value of $3,696 per student. So now this is where the rubber hits the road. We want to know what the actual fee amount is. This table here summarizes basically the preceding slides that we've presented in terms of what the level of service standard is. For instance, how many square feet per student, then what does it cost to build bricks and mortar. We do the same thing for land, operations support, and buses. And if you look 3 lines up from the bottom, we see what the total gross cost per student is. Okay, so for K through 8, it's $20,587. And for 9 through 12, it's $27,633. Then there's in red, you see the credit for offsetting revenue per student. So then we get a net capital cost per student of $15,580 at the K through 8 level and $23,937 at the 9 through 12 level. Now, in terms of the actual fee, the top part of the table, and this is for Williamson County schools, This is for all new residential development outside of the Franklin Special School District. So we look at we take those pupil generation rates we talked about earlier on in the study. So in this case, a single-family house generates 0.387 K through 8 students, and we multiply that by the $15,580.76 to get a K through 8 impact fee of $6,035. Okay, we do the same thing for the 9 through 12 or high school level. There's 0.167 students generated per single-family unit, multiplied by $23,937.67, which is shown in the middle of the table, for a high school impact fee of $3,998. So the total fee in this draft for a single-family unit would be $10,033. We do the same sort of approach for a multifamily unit. Multifamily means apartment. That is an impact fee per unit of $5,227. Finally, the impact fee for new residential developments located within the Franklin Special School District. If you remember, development within the Franklin Special School District is only paying the Williamson County high school component of the fees because they provide their own K through 8 facilities. And so the single family fee there would be $3,998 for high schools, and the multifamily would be $1,620 per unit. And again, I think it's important to note that this is just for new construction only. Does not apply to existing housing units. And so the way the fee would be administered is usually at the time of building permit, the applicant would pay the impact fee. It's also important to note that the fee would not apply to age-restricted housing units, okay? So if a development comes in that is deed-restricted for a 55 and over neighborhood, they would not pay a school impact fee. That is very different than an applicant that walks through the door and says, we're marketing this development to an older demographic. Well, if it's not deed restricted, there's no guarantee that that's going to occur. And so they would be eligible or would incur the school impact fee. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions the audience may have. And I think Joe Horn has a microphone to pass around.
Yeah, I can get it. How did I know this?
One question is.
Sure.
Are you assuming that the future schools will be paid for with cash only?
No. Nina Graham is here from the Budget and Finance Department, who can also answer this question. But typically what happens, since impact fees are a new revenue source for you, typically what would happen is, let's say Williamson County needs to build a new high school 3 years from now. And let's just say that the cost of that school is $50 million, okay? If the community already has banked, let's say $20 million in impact fees for high schools, a lot of times they use that $20 million as a down payment, or they buy the land and then bond finance the rest of that $30 million. So it's usually some sort of combination thereof.
But every one of these people that have been moved here, a house, is going to be paying taxes. And part of those taxes is debt service.
Right.
So why do you give credit for the debt service that to pay for the new house?
Because it's two reasons. One is the privilege tax is going to pay for a portion of that debt service, okay? And then the portion that privilege tax doesn't pay is paid for through general fund revenue, okay? So let's just say the debt service payment's $10 million in a year. Let's say you use $6 million from excise tax, or excuse me, the privilege tax. So the other $4 million, that delta $4 million, needs to be paid for through general fund revenue. So that's why we're giving credit for all the debt service, not only the principal, but also the interest. If we just did the portion for the privilege tax, the credit would be less because only a portion of that debt service is being paid for.
So you are giving credit for this?
Yes. Yeah.
That one.
Okay, that wasn't clear?
That was not.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's clear. Or
So the debt service that those new residents
Well, it's because the debt service credit depends on the approach, okay? So since we're doing a consumption-based or an incremental expansion approach, you typically give a debt service credit if you have incurred debt to get to your assets that you have today, okay? If you do a plan-based approach, you do a different approach to credits. If you do a cost recovery, there's even a different approach to the credit. So it depends on the methodology, number one, and it also depends on how the community is retiring the debt. For instance, in Florida, each school, they are their own taxing districts, okay? So they're not funded by the county's general fund. So they actually have a mill levy that goes just to capital, okay, that they get every year. And so what you do with debt service there is if you're paying 50% of that debt service with that 2 mil money, okay, if you gave 100% debt service credit and credit for the 2 mil money, you've double credited because you're using the 2 mil money to make the 50% debt payment, okay? So does that make sense?
I think so. I'm getting lost in.
Yeah, credits are complicated.
Okay. It didn't seem like when you were going through this, you were getting credit. I think I'd have to go into it in more depth. Let me ask you one other question.
Sure.
Why would it, the builders, when they build a house, they have to get a loan for the house. And they have to, it seemed like it'd be simple to, would it be okay, or some communities looked at it as collecting the fee at the CO, the certificate of occupancy, rather than at the building permit?
There are some communities that do collect fees at time of CO. It's far more popular to collect it at time of building permit. I mean, I don't have empirical data at my fingertips, but my guess would be at least 80% of the communities that we work with across the country collect it at time of building permit.
But it is legal to do it at the CO.
Well, the problem with this is that we have the private act that specifies when we collect it. It's collected at the building permit issuance, or if there's no building permit, we get that at the CO.
Right.
So the private act covers that. The other question is could you do it in other communities? I know Franklin did this when they were looking at their transportation impact fee or their road impact fees, is to phase it in over a long period of time, say 5 or 10 years.
5 or 10 years is a long time. I will tell you that many communities, particularly ones that are implementing impact fees for the first time, a lot of them do phase in the fee, and the reason for that is because, as you mentioned earlier, builders have obtained financing based on a certain set of assumptions, and those assumptions probably didn't include a $10,000 impact fee, and so that's one reason why communities phase the fee in over time. I've never seen a community personally phase it in over a 5 or 10 year period. It's usually some sort of schedule where it's one level for 6 months and full freight maybe a year. Sometimes it goes to 2 years, but that's about as far as I've seen it.
I'm sorry. Part of that argument was not only what you just said about
Mm-hmm.
calculations, but part of the argument is that the increased fee of $10,000 per lot for a house would push up the cost of the house, and which may slow down growth. So if growth is slowed down, then you couldn't build schools, you couldn't have parks, you couldn't have all the other things. What growth has done is growth is paid for all of the amenities that this county has had in the last 25 or 30 years. Like when I first came here in '79, we had 200 or 300 miles of gravel roads.
Right.
I think today we have 0. We had no park. We had one public park. Today we have hundreds of acres of parks. We had no recreation centers. We had no libraries. All the parks and recreation facilities were privately owned, and all of the costs were done by private clubs. And so the growth is really paid for this county to phase it in and just see what happens to the growth as compared to what happens there. Because if we kill growth in this county, then we, in my opinion, we kill this county.
I guess the thing I'm most concerned about is finding homes for people who want to move here that are just good, average people. I'm not talking workforce necessarily, but what we're really looking for are people who can buy that $300,000 house, which, believe it or not, in this county is getting hard to find. I'm just scared that you add this on the front end, and then when the builder goes out to pull a permit, he's got to add a certain percentage on top of this in closing. So he pulls it for 10,000, he's probably going to charge 15. Just guessing. I'm a realtor, not a builder.
Right.
But those guys, a lot of people think they make quite a bit of money, but most of them, they have to watch their pennies. And I don't know how this fly with them, but the figures that I've seen you guys put out are quite frankly baffling. I mean, I just sat down and I went through everything that you guys have had previously and looked at it. We've had NAR look at it as well. There have been constitutionality challenges in some areas of the country. I don't know what would happen here as far as what the realtors would consider doing, but $10,000 is a pretty good thing. So, it needs to be kept in mind.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess so. Trying to think which one I want to take first. I mean, we've heard the concern about the workforce housing, and one of the things that the county could do as a policy, is you define a certain level of affordability, and then there could be a program for reduced or waived fees, with the caveat that the fee program has to be made whole through, if you're waiving, let's say, half of the impact fee, the general fund would have to make up the difference in order to make the program whole. So that's one reason one option. You mentioned, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. You mentioned $300,000 house, and who ends up paying the impact fee varies depending on the situation we have with the economy. So in a robust economy, typically, the entire cost plus sometimes gets passed on to the home buyer. In a dwindling economy, everybody takes a hit. The person who sells the land sells the land for less. Developer takes less profit. Some of it gets passed on to the home builder. So the economics of it vary by economic situation. But let's just assume a $300,000 house. If you add $10,000 to the cost of that house, it's basically increasing the cost of that house about $37 a month. So that puts it in, when you look at it in those terms, it's $10,000, but most people get a 30-year mortgage. And so that $10,000 becomes $37 a month, which isn't, in my opinion, isn't make or break if you're buying a house at a $300,000 level. So that's just a devil's advocate point. And I'm trying to remember the other. I'm not worried about that because you do have a private act, and impact fees are challenged, but they haven't been found non-constitutional. What they get challenged for is typically for methodological reasons. So that's not as much of an issue from my perspective, because we obviously stand by our work. And obviously now that there's the actual report available, which does explain the numbers, because you're seeing this in tabular form, and so it certainly helps to have the narrative associated with that. And was there another point you made that I didn't answer?
No, my biggest concern out of this is we don't want to stop.
You were sure.
By any means. During the great real estate meltdown, 2008 on up, we saw a lot of builders, developers
Sure.
I don't ever want to see that come back. Realtors, struggle as well.
I was in the same position. I mean, if you're in the impact fee business and growth slows, your revenue goes down quickly.
It's real dollars that we're all
Yeah.
looking at out here. True, $37 doesn't sound like that much a month, but on the other hand, I know a lot of people who buy homes that are really stretching.
Yeah.
They cut their food budget and everything else to get in.
Right.
But a caveat to this is that we want good stewards.
Okay. Okay.
We really do. In this county, in fact, I just left some people who are trying to get into this county.
Right.
Just for this, for schools. And it's a struggle.
Yeah.
That's, I don't know what will happen. What happens from here? Does the county commission take this under advisement and just vote on it? Or do we have other hearings?
You will hear when we have another hearing next week in Williamson, the high school, next, 21st. And then after that, I'm not sure how quickly the county commission will act on that.
Just one vote?
Yes.
One other. I was here for your previous
Mhm.
presentation, and you had two methods of doing the.
Right. Right.
Have you dropped the method of going to the square footage?
Yeah, you must have been in one of the previous meetings. At the last meeting we had 3 meetings. We had one with the finance committee, and then 2 meetings back to back that commissioners and the general public were at. And a decision was made at the last meeting that we were going to go with this, what we call the one size fits all, meaning that all single family is treated the same, all multifamily is treated the same, because it's a little easier to administer, particularly since this is a new program. For those of you who are watching at home who or didn't see our previous presentations, the alternative method we used was what we call a progressive fee structure, which varies by size of house, because we've got data that shows that smaller houses generate fewer people and fewer school children, and so the larger homes, up to a certain point, pay a larger school impact fee.
That does affect the affordability.
Well,
It's not-
it helps with
it's really not fair.
it helps with affordability. It makes the smaller houses, which typically are the entry level, yeah.
I mean, doing
Yeah.
one size fits all.
That is certainly an argument against it, yeah.
And, could that be a possibility? Could the county commission still consider the other alternative, since you've already?
Yeah,
made it?
I would say that anything is possible at this point, and my guess is, and I'm just editorializing here, is my guess is that the collective we, meaning the consulting team, the county, and legal team will sort of reconnoiter after the next week's public meeting and look at the impact, or the feedback we got through these public forums, and make some policy decisions about how to go forward.
Well, to be fair, it doesn't seem right that someone generating less students per house and paying more. In other words, if we build a house in Hardbar, a 1,200-foot house with one child, as opposed to a 6,000 square foot house in Brentwood with 3 or 4 children, that doesn't seem to be fair that the house in Hardbar would pay the same fee as a house in Brentwood.
Any other questions, comments?
I believe the last meeting I attended, you mentioned that this money had to be used in a certain time frame. Is that true?
Yes. And what does the private act say? Is it 6 years, or does it say specifically? It doesn't say. It varies by state. I mean, each state has, most states have their own enabling statutes. I think there's 28 states that have enabling statutes right now. Other states, impact fees are allowed by home rule. And so this is a very similar situation as the home rule states, where if the private act doesn't specify a time period to spend the money, generally what the courts say is 6 years. Because usually that mirrors the horizon of the capital improvement plan. There are some states that allow 8 years. Utah and Arizona allow 10 years for you to expend the money.
if you had a downturn in the economy and had your money there, what would be the process, or what would happen to the money?
That's a great question. And my guess is that, and I don't know of any lawsuits that have been filed because of that situation, but, well, not related to this particular question. I think what would happen is, as long as you are making an effort to spend the money, meaning that it can be as simple as funding the A&E, the design of the new school, purchasing the land. It doesn't mean that all the school has to be built. You have to be making progress, okay? And I think that the courts would think that they would understand that, one, there's been an economic downturn, and rather than 6 years, the school is now going to be built in the 8th year, but the county's been doing its due diligence and moving forward. My guess is, and I'm not an attorney, that there wouldn't be any ramifications. But that is a good question. But the 6 years is really meant to guard against communities just collecting the money and sitting on it for 10, 15, and 20 years, which I've seen some communities do with money for like general governments, police, and parks. You never see that with schools. But it's you know, you got to show the fee payer, give the fee payer their benefit within a certain period of time.
The other thing, I'd just like to ditto what was said over here. I think that it should be looked at again as far as the one size fits all, and that doesn't seem like feasible and right there. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Well, seeing none, I invite you to come out for our next public forum. It'll be again Wednesday, February 21st at Noblesville High School. We'll be in the auditorium. I don't know exactly where the auditorium is at Noblesville High School right now. It's brand new. We're trying to find it, and it'll be signed important, but I do appreciate it.